I'm Anthony Arvin, and welcome to my studio. I get asked a lot about drawing realistically. A lot of artists hope that they can discover some trick or some technique that will suddenly help them up their game and be able to draw more realistically. I wish I could wave a magic wand for you or pull a rabbit out of the hat that would make this an easy undertaking, but it really is not. I can, however, give you a few tips that would help make your time learning more efficient. And probably the best advice I could give would be based on how you learn to see. I didn't learn how to draw as much as I learned how to see what's actually there. When you're trying to do realistic art, you're trying to replicate something very accurately. There's a concept of having the I in your mind as an adversary during this process. There was a book written in the 70s by an author named Betty Edwards, and she proposed the idea of the I in your mind. And the I in your mind actually interprets for your brain what you're seeing. That way you can, if you see a photograph, you can pick out the hands, for example, or you could pick out the feet. Because the I in your mind is analyzing what these shapes are and it's telling you, okay, that's what this is. Well, that same function insists on being in control of how you draw. And so when you see on an image that you're trying to draw the person's hands, you're seeing with your eye one thing, but your brain is interpreting something completely different. And that is because the I in your mind wants to actually control what you draw. So it tells you what you're seeing. And the fact is, the I in our mind is a pretty poor artist. Yes, there are people who learn to train the I in their mind, especially people who do caricatures, cartoonists, and that sort of thing. They learn thousands of what she referred to as symbols, for example, for hands. Every angle you could possibly imagine drawing a hand, your eye and your mind can be trained. Okay, this is what it would look like at this angle, and this is what it would look like at that angle. And what they're actually doing is training the eye in their mind by plugging in symbols that they can refine. And eventually those symbols kind of become how you recognize that artist's work. If you saw Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, he has a certain way of drawing eyes, and the artist has a certain way of drawing hair. And you can recognize that artist's work, even if he did completely different characters. The symbols that he uses for hands or feet or any of those, they're recognizable. So what you want to do is learn to lose the influence of the I in your mind and skip to drawing what's actually there. Learn to see what's actually there. And that's probably the biggest advancement you can make with less effort than to spend thousands of hours trying to train the I in your mind, and you're actually getting farther away from realism rather than closer to it. So if you can imagine, when I see an image, it's actually, it doesn't resemble what everybody else sees on that image. I've trained myself to see the shapes and the shades that make up an image. And it kind of resembles a whole table full of those ink blot images like they use on psych eval. They hold that up and say, what does this remind you of? Well, those ink blots actually share a lot in common to the way images actually look. So when I see an image, it's like a whole table of those random ink blot images, and I see those different odd shapes, how they plug together. I see the difference in the shade of them, or the texture, or the contrasts. And I just take those images and I recreate them faithfully. And not just their shape, but also their shade. And if you can imagine puzzle pieces, you see the individual puzzle pieces, they don't make a lot of sense. But once they're all snapped together, you have a beautiful photograph. And Images are made up of these really funky and odd shapes and shades. Shapes that the eye in your mind doesn't recognize and doesn't want to recognize, because it's still trying to control. It's trying to say, no, this is what hands look like, or no, this is what eyes look like. And it's trying to force you to use one of those symbols. So when you learn to actually see what's there, you can more faithfully reproduce what's there. Think of it in terms of with a Xerox copier. A Xerox copier doesn't know how to draw hands, but it can take an image of a photograph and pixel at a time, line at a time, it says, okay, this one's black, and it creates a black spot. This one's white, so it leaves a white spot. This one's a dark gray, so it creates a dark gray. And it does that each line for line all the way down the page. And in the end, it's done a magnificent job of replicating what's there. Well, if there's hands on that picture, then it replicated hands. Now, it has no knowledge those hands existed, because the Xerox doesn't have an eye in its mind telling him, ooh, no, that's not what hands look like. They look like this. It just faithfully copied the individual pixels across. Well, as an artist, we're not good enough to go pixel by pixel, but we can go shape by shape and take the shade of that and replicate the shade. And once you do that and you see how they all plug together, if you replicate those shapes and those shades faithfully, when you get done and back up and look at it, suddenly a beautiful picture emerges. And we're not necessarily lucky enough to have an original image most of the time that's perfect. So often we're trying to fix contrasts, or we're trying to bring details out of something that's maybe really dark, and we need to lighten those up, or maybe parts of the photograph is washed out and we need to add some color back in or contrast back in. So when we're doing those shapes and shades, we are still interpreting and changing in order to fix lighting and fix contrast and that sort of thing. But as far as the shapes, yeah, we want them dead on. We want them, nail them. Sometimes even 2 millimeters can take, especially on a portrait. If you get a person's eye out just 2 millimeters, suddenly it doesn't look like them anymore. And especially on the smaller images where 2 millimeters is actually a lot. So you've got to be able to take those shapes, see them, and replicate them. But you also have difficult time sometimes getting that shape exactly right the first time. It's one of the reasons I draw with the number 2 lead pencil, because I can erase, and I do erase a lot. But it's kind of like those little they're not cartoons, but they're puzzles that come in the newspaper, and it shows you 2 images that appear to be the same. And they say there's 7 differences in these, try to find them. So you're looking at it and trying to determine what's different between this image and this image, and finally you see one, you write down what it is. Well, when you're drawing, it's kind of the same way, in that I'm looking at what's there, and I'm looking at what I've drawn, and I'm trying to figure out why this doesn't look right until I see the differences, and then I fix it. It's that simple. When you can see what's actually there, what you're actually trying to replicate, not in terms of big picture things like, well, this is a hand, or this is an eyeball, or this is an ear. When you're just looking at those shapes and shades that make up that image, you can go through and fix those little differences. And the more that you find and the more that you fix, the more accurate and the more realistic your drawing is becoming. But because you can see, you don't have to be trained. I'm completely self-trained as an artist. I did learn from printers how to do the pen and inks so that the printing press could make a beautiful image once it's printed on a printing press. But as far as learning to draw on things, that's pretty much on me. And it's just because I learned to see. And it's kind of like mowing the yard. When you start up the lawnmower and you take off across the grass, when you get to the other side, you turn around to come back. Nobody has to tell you what to do next. You can see where it's been mowed and where it hasn't been. So you move the lawnmower over to where it hasn't been and you come back across the yard. It's a no-brainer. It's very logical because you can see what needs to be done. And drawing's the same way. When you can see what's there and see what you've drawn and you see what's right and what's wrong, you can fix it because it's obvious to you what you do. So that's the best tip I could give an artist who wants to pursue realism in their art. And that is, learn to look beyond the components of an image and look at the little pieces that make up, the little shapes and the little shades. And those shapes may be defined by shadows or a difference in texture on the skin or whatever you're working on. So it can be defined by color or texture or all kinds of changes in light. Figure out what all those little shapes actually are and learn to make those faithfully. And your drawings will come to life. It'll help a lot. So, thank you for visiting my studio, and I'll see you on the next video.